The aroma of herbs and spices filled the air, mingling with the sound of their laughter. Watching them, I felt a pang of longing, for simplicity, for clarity, for a life where choices weren't so fraught with consequence. Emma noticed us first, her face lighting up as she waved us over. "There you are? I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." Her joke landed awkwardly, the irony cutting deeper than she could know. I forced a smile, nodding as I joined her at the counter. "Just enjoying the scenery," I said, my voice hollow even to my own ears. Richard, ever the master of composure, seamlessly inserted himself into the conversation, asking about the meal and complimenting Mrs. Bennet's cooking. His ease only heightened my unease, reminding me of the chasm between the persona he presented to the world and the complexity he revealed in private. Lunch passed in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. I contributed as little as possible, focusing instead on the rhythm of my fork against the plate, the texture of the food in my mouth. Every bite tasted like ash. Later that afternoon, Emma suggested we take a walk together. "Just the two of us," she added, glancing at her parents. "It'll be nice to get some fresh air." I agreed, though the thought of being alone with her filled me with dread. As we strolled along a trail that hugged the edge of the property, she linked her arm through mine, leaning into me with a familiarity that once felt comforting but now felt suffocating. "You've been distant lately," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" The question caught me off guard. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything, to let her decide what came next. But the words stuck in my throat, trapped by the weight of their implications. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Just thinking about work, I guess." She frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You're not yourself, Ethan. I can feel it. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Her sincerity nearly broke me. Here was the woman I loved, offering me the chance to be honest, to share the burden I had been carrying alone. But how could I? How could I shatter the trust she placed in me, the life we had built together? "I promise," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "If there was something to tell, you'd be the first to know." Emma studied me for a moment, her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give her. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Okay," she said softly. "But remember, I'm here if you need me." Her words stayed with me long after we returned to the cabin, echoing in my mind like a mantra. They were a reminder of what I stood to lose, of the stakes involved in the decision I had yet to make. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, I found myself drawn once more to the kitchen. The house was quiet, everyone else having retired to their rooms. Only Richard remained, seated at the table with a cup of tea in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I shook my head, moving to sit across from him. "Too much on my mind." For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, finally, I spoke. "What happens now?" Richard set his cup down, his gaze steady. "That depends on you," he said simply. "No one can make this decision for you, Ethan. Not me, not Emma, not anyone." His words were true, but they offered little comfort. I wanted guidance, certainty, a clear path forward. Instead, I was faced with a labyrinth of possibilities, each one leading to an unknown destination. What if I choose wrong? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There's no such thing as a wrong choice," he said after a moment. "Only choices that shape who you become. The question is, are you ready to face the person you might become?" His question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. I realized then that the choice before me wasn't just about Emma or Richard, about staying or leaving. It was about who I wanted to be, about the kind of life I wanted to live. And that realization, more than anything else, terrified me. As the night wore on, I found myself pacing the length of the cabin's living room, my thoughts spiraling endlessly. The weight of Richard's words pressed down on me, demanding answers I wasn't sure I had. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. It was a sound that should have been soothing, but instead it only amplified the turmoil inside me. I thought about Emma, the way her laughter lit up a room, the way she believed in me even when I doubted myself. She was my anchor, my safe harbor. With her, I knew what to expect, a life of stability, of shared dreams and quiet contentment. But was that enough? Was it fair to her to stay if part of me longed for something else? And then there was Richard, the man who had shattered my carefully constructed worldview, who had shown me a side of myself I hadn't known existed. He was dangerous, unpredictable, a force of nature I couldn't hope to tame. Yet there was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that called to a part of me I couldn't suppress. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time I couldn't afford to waste. Tomorrow would come, bringing with it the need for action, for decisions. I couldn't keep existing in this liminal space, caught between two worlds that demanded everything I had to give. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The questions swirling in my mind refused to settle, each one more insistent than the last. Who was I? What did I want? What kind of life was I willing to fight for? And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, Richard appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway, before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "You're still awake," he observed, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, unable to find the words to explain why. He moved closer, settling into the armchair across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, charged with unspoken truths and unresolved tensions. Finally, Richard broke it. "You're running out of time," he said, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Tomorrow, you'll have to choose." "I know," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "But how do I choose when both options feel impossible?" He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You don't choose based on what's impossible. You choose based on what's true. What feels right, even if it scares you." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord I hadn't realized was there. I thought about the fear that had gripped me since this journey began. The fear of losing Emma, of disappointing Richard, of betraying myself. But beneath that fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope, of possibility, of a future I couldn't yet imagine. What if I hurt people? I asked, voicing the fear that had haunted me since the beginning. What if I ruin everything? Richard's expression softened, the hard edges of his authority giving way to something more vulnerable. "You can't control the consequences of your choices," he said gently. "All you can do is act with integrity, with honesty. The rest, that's out of your hands." His words were a balm to my frayed nerves, offering a clarity I hadn't known I needed. I realized then that I had been so focused on avoiding pain that I had forgotten the importance of authenticity, of being true to myself, even if it meant facing uncertainty, even if it meant risking everything. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice steadier than it had been in days. "For everything." Richard nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Whatever you decide, Ethan, remember this. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone." With that, he stood and left the room, leaving me to sit in the quiet darkness, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a glimmer of resolve. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would face it, not as the man I thought I should be, but as the man I truly was. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the cabin's wooden floor. I woke to the sound of birdsong and the distant murmur of voices in the kitchen. Emma and her mother were already up, preparing breakfast, their laughter mingling with the clatter of dishes. The normalcy of the scene was almost surreal, given the storm raging inside me. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, as if delaying the inevitable could somehow buy me more time. But time, as always, marched forward, indifferent to my struggles. By the time I emerged from the bedroom, the table was set, the air filled with the aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread. "Good morning," Emma greeted me, her smile warm but tinged with concern. "Sleep well?" I nodded, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Yeah, just thinking a lot." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she handed me a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing mine in a gesture that once felt intimate but now felt heavy with unspoken questions. Breakfast passed in a blur of small talk and forced cheerfulness. Richard was unusually quiet, his presence commanding yet subdued. Occasionally, his eyes would meet mine, and in those brief moments, I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. After the meal, Emma suggested we take a walk, just to stretch our legs before we head home, she explained, her tone light, but her eyes searching mine for something I couldn't give her. I agreed, though the thought of being alone with her filled me with a mixture of dread and relief. As we strolled along a trail that wound through the woods, she linked her arm through mine, leaning into me with a familiarity that once felt comforting but now felt suffocating. "You've been distant," she said finally, her voice soft but tinged with sadness. "I can feel it, Ethan. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Her words cut deeper than she could know. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess the turmoil I had been carrying, to let her decide what came next. But how could I? How could I shatter the trust she placed in me, the life we had built together? "I'm sorry," I said instead, my voice cracking slightly. "I've just been thinking a lot. About us. About the future." Emma stopped walking, turning to face me. Her eyes searched mine, seeking answers I wasn't sure I had. "Do you still want this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you still want us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to say yes, to reassure her that everything was fine, that I loved her and only her. But the words stuck in my throat, trapped by the weight of their implications. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure things out." Her expression crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Is it someone else?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Is it my dad?" The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to deny it, to reassure her that she was mistaken, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as the truth hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. Emma stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself as if to shield against the pain. I thought we had something real," she said, her voice shaking. "But I guess I was wrong." "No," I said quickly, reaching for her hand. "Emma, please. It's not like that. I love you. I do. But I need to figure out who I am, what I want." She pulled her hand away, her expression a mixture of hurt and anger. "Then figure it out," she said sharply. "But don't drag me into your confusion. Don't use me as a placeholder while you sort through your feelings for someone else." Her words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had been using her, however unintentionally, as a shield against the chaos inside me. And now, faced with the consequences of my indecision, I realized how unfair I had been. "I'm sorry," I said again, my voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I need space," she said finally. "Time to think, to decide if I can forgive this, if I can trust you again." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone on the trail, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like never before. When I returned to the cabin, Richard was waiting for me in the living room. He stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that mirrored my own. "She knows," I said simply, my voice hollow. Richard nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "I figured as much," he replied, his tone measured but tinged with regret. How is she? Not good, I admitted, sinking into a chair. She needs space. Time to think. He crossed the room, settling into the armchair across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, charged with unspoken truths and unresolved tensions. You did the right thing, Richard said finally, his voice steady but kind. Telling her, being honest. I shook my head, my chest tightening with guilt. Did I? Or did I just make things worse? Hurt the person I love most? Richard leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Love isn't about avoiding pain, he said firmly. It's about being honest, even when it hurts. Even when it risks everything. His words resonated deeply, striking a chord I hadn't realized was there. I thought about the fear that had gripped me since this journey began. The fear of losing Emma, of disappointing Richard, of betraying myself. But beneath that fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope, of possibility, of a future I couldn't yet imagine. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's up to you, he said. Both of you. But whatever you decide, remember this. You can't go back to the way things were. Not after this. I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. He was right. There was no going back, no pretending that this weekend hadn't changed everything. The only question was, what came next? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadow, I realized that the answer wasn't something I could find in this moment. It would take time, reflection, and courage to navigate the path ahead. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a glimmer of resolve. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would face it, not as the man I thought I should be, but as the man I truly was. And perhaps, in that authenticity, I would find a way forward.